In the name of the one and only, we come back to you through the Indigo Firmament program, and we are continuing our discussion, the second segment of our discussion on the human phenomenon. In the previous segment, we discussed that in the context of God-human relationship, it is important to define the two sides of the equation. We spend enough time on discussing God in historical terms, but more significantly, we concentrated in the previous program on the four dimensions of understanding God as a perceptive God, an essential God, a transcendent God, and an immanent God. And the opposite side of the equation, the human element, is what we were talking about. We discussed how humans do not know themselves as they should, or if they can. In it, I outlined that we will discuss humans, ourselves, as biological beings, as intellectual beings, as intuitive beings, as psycho-spiritual beings, and as mythical beings. Now, this is not the complete list. It's just an outline. Where we end up, frankly speaking, I don't know. But we can start. And as we did in the previous program, we discussed that biologically we are much more than the physicality of a collection of cells that have come together to form life. Now I want to step into the next discussion, which is the intellectual humans as the intellectual beings. When we talk about our intellectual nature, we are talking about the human mind. Often when we refer to the human mind, the assumption is made that we are talking about the human brain. When we are talking about the human brain, the assumption is made that then everything as far as our intellectual being comes from the brain. In other words, even our intellectualism, or more correctly, even our intellectual nature is reduced to the physicality of the human brain, which need not be so. The brain and the human body, the nervous system, it is, according to one study that I have perused through, indicate is a collection of 86 billion nerve endings. That's quite a staggering number, 86 billion. For many of us, it's difficult even to assume what that number means, quantitatively speaking, of course. But the brain that contains, the human brain that contains that many nerve endings that are interacting, responding, reacting, it's difficult to understand how can we zero in on anything in particular to be identified as the human mind. Now, the organ is there. The symptoms can be detected, interpreted, understood. The signs and intensities can be measured. But is the human mind the totality of these? And is the human the human brain, now, is the human brain similar or indifferent than the brain of other living beings, at least those that are similar to us, the chimps and the gorillas and, say, the elephants and so on? I do not claim to understand the biological element of that. I'm trying to simply raise questions. And my attempt here is not to prove anything, because I have no qualifications as a scientist, as a medical doctor, as a neurologist, as a biologist. I have none of that. My objective in this discussion is simply to acknowledge that we humans are much more sophisticated than all the scientists of these various fields that claim to understand a small portion or a small element or a unique dimension of that which we then can call our humanity. And my thinking is then that our intellectual being is again a sphere containing that mind of ours, that is operated, that applies, that utilizes the nervous system and the brain and all the physical parts that we can observe. But in and of itself, it is something other than all of these physical entities. Take an idea, for instance. What is an idea? How do we get it? Where does it come from? It's possible that when we get an idea, perhaps certain nerve endings in the human brain sparkle, interact, show some signs. Say that idea might be emotional reaction to certain things in our environment, and how emotionally we respond to something can be measured. Modern sciences has advanced that far, that they can be the intensity of it can be measured. But is the reaction, is the response, is the intensity of the nerve endings in our brain defining the idea as to what it is? I don't think so. I'm thinking that the idea itself is beyond that. The brain is not the mind. The mind is not the brain. Yes, hunger is not the stomach. Taste is not the tongue. In most of these cases, we reduce these phenomena into just the physical element with which we can identify it. Yeah, you can say hunger is a feeling. How about getting satiated? When you are full, when you are satisfied with the food you digest, with which you enjoy, your palates, your taste buds. There's a lot more going on there. And in every aspect, we reduce all of this to the physical part of our body where it is detected and measured. Now, in terms of our digestive system, it's one thing, but I think it's in terms of our intellectual being that it is beyond any understanding, especially of mine, certainly of mine, that how do we get an idea? Can we stimulate it? Can we push ourselves? Can we program ourselves? Can we create a cause and effect in an idea? Can we invite an idea? Can we buy an idea? Can we put an idea in our heads, as they say in the common language? The idea itself is undefinable. We somehow experience it. We get it. How do we get it? I have no idea. I have no idea how I get an idea, including the idea I'm talking about right now. I have no idea. I don't know if science has an idea. But they may have ways to measure through certain parts of our physical being, through reactions, the measurement of the intensities, and so on and so forth. And for that matter, even the response. So I get an idea, and I share that idea with someone else by communicating. Yes, look at the language part of it. We produce certain sounds, we make noises, and these sounds and noises, these phonemes, these morphemes, these units of sounds are encoded with meaning in different linguistic, cultural contexts. Take the word love, for example. The mere utterance of it, it creates a feeling, an emotion. Put it in a sentence, express it to a person, and watch their reaction. Now, where did the idea of love come to you? Is it simply a power of being attracted, or is there more to it? And if so, once the idea is expressed to another, watch that interaction. Again, measure it by the most advanced scientific equipment we have. Measuring the intensity and the, say, sparks of the nerve endings in the brain of the person who hears the word or the statement of I love you, for example. And then the first person who says it to the second person and watches the reaction in the second person. Rejection, acceptance, smile, anger, frowning, all these body languages that appears on the face of the person who was, for lack of a better term, subjected to the statement I love you, then creates a reaction in the first person. Whether this idea that occurred to the first person was received with acceptance by the second person or received with rejection, and how ought either one of those, acceptance or rejection, of that statement of affection then affects the person who initiated that whole thought, that whole idea, that whole notion. Therefore, if you look at each individual beings with all their estimated 86 billion nerve endings. That is one thing, to quantify it. But none of that answers us to where that idea came from. And of course, as this transmits to the other person, that simple sentence, I love you, or its equivalent in any other language, has the cultural coloring that not every culture people express the idea of intimacy and attraction and love and affection in the same way. In some cultures, certain words might be taboo. In others, they might be more acceptable. In some cultures, they may have just one or two words for love, but in others, there might be many words. And each word might express a different sorts of intimacy: familial, parental, romantic, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the encoding of the cultural concepts into words themselves may create different degrees of intimacy and different degrees of intensity, brainwave, if we can call it that. It may not be the right term. So the word love, for instance, at least in my estimation, is perhaps one of the most abused words in the English language. Abused in the sense that it is thrown about for everything. You love a hamburger, you love a person, you love a dog, and you love a certain color, etc., etc. And because of that, then the intensity of it may not be the same as, say, in the Arabic or in the Dari, Farsi, or Pashto language, in which we have more words that are tailored to specific expressions of more specified desires in attraction to the other, and each may not produce the same result, and there will be variance that can be measured again, to go back to the argument, at the neuron endings. So to go back to the part of the argument we started, who are we intellectually? How do we get ideas? How do we interact? How do we measure them? And is brain, the human brain, really the center of all of our intellectual being, or is our intellectual being beyond that? Our intellectual being, is it in the physical, in the brain, or is it a field of energy that is contained in, say, our body? Go beyond that. Ought we claim an idea to be contained in our physicality? Are we contained in our physical body? If we are not our heart, if we are not our brain, and if we are, in a sense, a field of energy, does this field of energy extend beyond our skin? Is our skin the boundary of our beingness? Or do we operate and exist beyond our skin too? Because once you accept the fact that we are not just physical, then our physicality need not be the measure or the limitation of our being. Then the next part would be the intuitive self. Now, in the intellectual, we use our power of reason, our rationality. We have created a science, logic. And logic looks for pattern. In logic, we do not look for exception. It is through strict and straight patterns of occurrences, of sequencing and consequencing, that we can understand things. That the language of logic is the language of norms, the language of patterns, and once things are put in certain patterns, anything that deviates from that pattern is not acceptable. That's why they are called exceptions. So you cannot build a logical argument on the basis of exception. You build it on the basis of norms. You build it on the basis of patterns. Now, when we go to our intuitive knowledge, all of a sudden, that whole thing crumbles. The patterns are not there. The norms are not there. Somehow, you understand something, but if someone tells you how did you understand it, you cannot reason it. You cannot rationalize it. You cannot argue it. You simply accept it as intuitive knowledge. Can we deny it? Yes, if you're a strict rationalist, you will have to deny intuitive knowledge. It's not in their domain. But if you're an average human being and you rely back on your experience, you will often know that there have been not one or few, but many instances in your life that for some reason, or rather for no reason, you understood something to be so, and it was, but you cannot explain it why. And therefore, then there is perhaps a realm of our existence that is either parallel to our intellectual being or complementary to it, that helps us understand things, helps us feel things, helps us know things. And we often come to the conclusion, I did this and it was right, but I don't know why did I do it. I don't know why. Now, these are often dismissed as accidental or incidental or coincidental. But perhaps they are not. Perhaps there is more of our being that is beyond this compartmentalized beingness that is assigned to us. That the scientific approach to understanding a phenomena is to compartmentalize to cut and divide. And we keep cutting and dividing with the ultimate aim of understanding it, because we think that if we can divide and understand a small part of it, and then we understand all the other small parts and components of it, and that if we can put all of the small components and put them together, then we will understand the total. But then we find out that the sum total is greater than the parts. And it's in that sum total that we have to look for other phenomena, such as our intuitive being. Who are we as an intuitive being? Our intuitive knowledge implies more of a wholeness within, rather the individuality, rather the single component. And so if we go to if we change our approach to a wholeness that contains our biological being, our rational intellectual being, and our intuitive being, and if we have an attitude of not precluding or excluding any one of those, but rather look at the comprehensive wholeness and totality of all those, we could probably think in more harmonic convergence than divergence, more in inclusivity rather than exclusivity. And so we have tackled, excuse the term, we have addressed the three aspects that I've outlined, and the fourth one is our psycho-spiritual being. Now, the term psycho-spiritual might be problematic to some, and for the following reason. We earlier talked about medical science and how the psychological, the psychoanalytical and all that was for a long time not a part of their equation, a necessary part for the treatment of human ills. It took a long time, at least in the West. Of course, in the Muslim East, they were always part and parcel of the whole treatment. But in the secularized West, it took a long time for, say, Sigmund Freud to establish, say, psychoanalysis as a part of the treatment of the human ills. When we use the word psychic, for example, the word itself implies total irrationality. And if we use the word psycho as a hyphenated or prefix to the word spiritual, then we go to the word spiritual. That too has a problem. That again, in the secular Western world, the term spiritual, that etymologically comes from the spirit, and the spirit is not physical. And as our science is concentrated more and more on the physical, we ended up accepting the monopoly of science at the expense and denial of anything and everything non-physical. Among those would be spirit. And no, I'm not talking about the ghosts of Christmas and the ghosts of people who have died and things of that nature. That might have its own place, but not in this program. My concern here is that in the spiritual part of it, we have a part of our being that is trying, at least in the context of the current cultural milieu, that we are more than our physical being, and that we are more than our rational and biological and intuitive, that there's another element, another dimension to our being. And that has to do with us being connected with a totality, a cosmic totality, at a different level. And to expand on that term level, then we can say that our beingness is made up of layers. And of course I'm oversimplifying this just to make this discussion a bit more understandable, is that in these layers we have our biological layer, our intellectual, intuitive, and psychospiritual, and so on. So that when you look at through all these layers, like the layers of a cake, you don't eat each layer of a cake separate and consider it a cake. All the layers laid on top of one another as a whole makes the cake. So you cut it in a way that you get a portion of each layer and a flavor of each layer. At the risk of making you a bit hungry, I hope you don't go to the refrigerator and lose the concentration for the discussion, is that it's possible you might have a layered cake in which each layer has a different flavor: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, fruit, and I don't know what else. My culinary skills are limited, like all my other skills. And so then try to transpose that onto what we're discussing, which is our beingness. And in it, if we only claim that in this layered cake that we are, if we only claim that we are chocolate cake, we are denying ourselves the totality of our being, or for that matter, any of the other flavors. I hope I don't raise your prejudices here for your taste buds, but the idea is that in our spiritual layer, we definitely go beyond our physical. And I was saying earlier, in the biological, we are probably limited to the confines of that which is contained within our skill. In the intellectual, we probably are, but we can't pinpoint to where. The assumption is often made to the brain and the nerve endings and neurons and all that, but maybe there is more. There are certain kinds of let me finish the other examples. And same thing goes with the intuitive. It's a knowledge we have, but we have no idea as to where it comes from, how it comes, and how do we know it. We only see it by the results. Now, in the psychospiritual, we can say with more certainty that in our psychospiritual layer, for lack of a better term, we cannot be contained to our physicality. We certainly go beyond that. And when we go beyond our skeleton and our flesh and bone, and when we go beyond our skin boundary, we definitely reach outwardly, and that reach is the one that we often refer to as that connectedness. So we go beyond our physical being to connect, and that connection has been traditionally understood and treated as the domain of religion. And with the secularization of Europe and partly America, and somehow by imitation in other parts of the world, that element of religion and theology has been either debunked or made irrelevant. And because spirit was understood only in religious context, and when religion was marginalized, therefore it was only a matter of time that spirit too ought to be made irrelevant. And so both the term psycho and spiritual individually suffer from this stigma, this cultural stigma of them being irrelevant in the cultural context. And therefore, to claim that we humans have a psycho-spiritual layer or a psycho-spiritual element to ourselves, most people would be dismissive of us, not even acknowledging it, because it's not fashionable, because it's not the in thing, because it does not seem relevant, because it is not scientific, because it's not observable. And therefore the idea is that it has to be observable to be understood, but we know that that is not so, because everything is not observable, not because of in and of itself, rather because of the limitations of our power of observation. So we do have then the psycho-spiritual side to ourselves too. So at least if we stop here, we know that we humans are much more than we often think of ourselves. Whether we understand ourselves, whether we acknowledge a particular dimension of ourselves, whether we are aware of a certain dimension of ourselves, and whether we operate within that particular dimension of ourselves. And so we can say then, just as much as in the God-human relationship, just as much as it's difficult to reduce God to a single dimensionality, it is equally wrong to reduce humans to a single dimension, and that both God and human are multidimensional in ways that we cannot understand. And as I said earlier, the four sides that I explained are not necessarily all that there is to it. This is how much I have just included in this outline, which is barely an hour old. And if I sit back and think more, I'm sure I can find a few more layers of our beingness. So, how do we understand this then? Understand it through sciences that are acceptable and credible, and so people would not think that we are crazy, cuckoo, obsolete, so that our thoughts are not considered to be fossilized in the rigidity of the past. And I think that we have to look at it in a more enlightened way. And by enlightened, I do not mean it in the sense of the understanding of the age of enlightenment. That, number one, we have to be ready for a paradigmatic shift. That we need not to become creatures of habit. Habits kill creativity. And if we kill creativity within us, we will simply be creatures of habit in the sense of imitating others or imitating ourselves, or simply not questioning reality. And if we don't question reality, we are dormant. We are dormant in our intuitive, spiritual, intellectual, biological, and other dimensions of our beingness. Therefore, it is necessary that we constantly think into it, that we invite ideas if we can, or we become the vessel and vehicle, the receptacle for ideas. And you do not become a receptacle for an idea unless you give away the signs of being receptive. You cannot be hugged if your arms are not open. So you have to have your arms open to hug and to be hugged. Here, I'm not talking about your I'm not talking about your physical arms. I'm inviting you and encouraging you to open up spiritually, psycho-spiritually, intuitively, intellectually, and in every other way to know who you are. Know yourself if you want to know your God. And these shifts of paradigmatic shifts have occurred in the past. The greatest awakening in human history, at least in the recorded human history, have been those of the shifts 180 degrees or more or less, when people went one way and then realized that they were wrong. In other words, their realization of you being wrong is a first step. We often don't assume that. We have protective egos. We have defensive egos. We can't do things wrong. We are always right. And in the context of how this had occurred is that the yearning for making that connection between the human and the divine has been there in the course of human history, recorded history and unrecorded history. Humans have realized that their totality is not within themselves. We discussed that in the previous program, actually in the previous 2-3 programs, when we were discussing the phenomenon of God. What I want to draw your attention to in this segment is that for as long as we know humanity through its cultures, through its history, through its traditions, through its religions, through their philosophies and so on, the seeking and being sought relationship had always been there. The only problem is that that which was being sought was always culturally defined, and therefore it took a long time for humanity to universalize it. Perhaps Christianity, but even more so Islam, has done more so to make God not culturally defined, but rather a universal God that is not just universal in the context of our earthly, terrestrial, cultural domains, but rather in the context of cosmic reality. But the quest in the human mind has been such that we always looked farther and outward and beyond to know what that phenomenon is. And to give you an analogy, as a person who loved to climb mountains, my personal experience had been such that I had often felt that the peak that was just ahead of me was the highest peak of the mountain. But only when I had conquered it, I had realized that I was far from it. And then I start trekking towards the next peak. And again, thinking that that was the highest. And you keep going. And then you realize that you become prey to your assumptions that every peak that is immediately visible and reachable, attainable, conquerable, is the ultimate one. And then you realize that you are being fooled by your assumptions and you're fooled by your perceptions. That beyond every peak there is a higher peak, and you keep going. And yes, there is ultimately a peak that is the ultimate. But in the quest for understanding God, as I said, in the human history, that has always been there. And the more we knew, the more we learned that we did not know enough. And just both through the analogy of climbing the mountain and the example I'm sharing with you in the quest for God, it gets to a point where you feel frustrated because you keep looking for something and you form an idea, but when you reach it, you find yourself being wrong. That's not encouraging, but frustrating. And therefore the conclusion among the wisest in our human history had been such that the more I know, the more I know that I do not know. Or the more I know, the more there is to know. But then I know that I cannot know it all. And so it's in this infinity that the arrogance of science, European sciences, was such that it was assumed that because we have made such great strides and such great advances in sciences, that at some point we ought to know what God is and where God is. Yes, for religion and theology it's easy, but for science it has to be observed. Now, because science used such a narrow criteria, by narrow I mean it reduced humanity to the single dimension of its rational mind, denying all the rest or considering them irrelevant, and therefore the rational mind could not find God, because our rational and intellectual prowess is based on our senses, and our senses have limitations, and using the restrictions and limitations of something, the dimension of us, that is limited by itself, cannot, in principle, measure the unlimited. You cannot measure the unlimited by the limited. And God has to be unlimited, because if it is limited and restricted and confined, it's not much of a God, certainly not for our 21st century thinking. Some older, traditional, tribal, or cultural gods may have had limitations, but we are far beyond that. So, somewhere along the line and along this polarized thinking of our most advanced cultures in the 17th and 18th century, and I'm talking about European mindset, is that in this polarization between reason and revelation came a time when the philosophers had to side with the scientists, and they were eventually called scientists. Science, by the way, is a more recent phenomenon, 200-300 years old. Before that, people didn't call anything science. That was knowledge in general, often referred to as philosophy. But this more fashionable and modernistic and up-to-date version of that is called science. So the God of the science and the God of the religion went separate ways. Now, instead of the scientific community in the West accepting the fact that yes, there is a God of the theologians, but there's also a God of the philosophers, as I referred to earlier, that there is the perceptive God and then there is the essential God, and that they ought to seek the essential God not from the perspective of the theologians, but from the perspective of the philosophers. However, because the word God was commonly used for both, and because religion was rejected, because theocracies were rejected, along with it, theology was also debunked or marginalized at least, and therefore it was no longer fashionable to talk about gods, let alone seeking them. So the easy route was taken, that yes, if you continuously expanded your knowledge, trying to know the unknowable, trying to know more, and then realize that the more you knew, the more you realized there was more to know. And this was kind of frustrating, endless seeking, and that in that frustration and that resentment and that polarization, the scientific community in Europe found an easy way out, and that was to deny God altogether, to make God all irrelevant. And therefore, it gives them more a sense of achievement, that so long as there is no God to seek, then everything you seek is something that can be observed. Since God could not be observed, could not be seen, and therefore just deny God any existence, and that denial will help you. Then you are no longer in a way where the farther you go, the more they move away the milestones from you, the more they move away the goalpost. And so instead of frustration, then you get a sense of achievement. And in this achievement, then, once God is denied, then you have this feeling of satisfaction. Then you know, then you are the master of yourself. Then God has not made you, but rather you, in essence, have made yourself, regardless of how much you really know yourself. But while the general trend and the more acceptable way of thinking this out had been one where God had become totally irrelevant in a secularized thinking, that we know that the best of our scientists have not denied it. The average scientist, yes, because it's fashionable. In any scientific community, in any academic circle, accepting God or believing in God, if it's not totally a risky proposition, it certainly does not help. And so while the average scientists have denied it, the highest ranking among them could not. The genius of geniuses in the 20th century, Albert Einstein, did not deny God. The super genius of the 21st century, Hawkins, does not deny God. In other words, there seems to be a realm, there seems to be a distance that if you operate within, like halfway between here and there, and deniability might be fashionable, but you eventually get to a point where you know that there's no way of denying it. And when I'm saying that, when I'm quoting Einstein or Hawkins, or if I'm talking about Voltaire's paradigmatic shift, in all of these, this is not an argument in favor of religion or for religion. Religion and theology are different things. We are not talking about religion. We are talking about God as a phenomenon. And in this present segment of the Indigo Firmament, we talked about human as a phenomenon. So both this phenomenological approach to a limited understanding of God and to a limited understanding of the human, we can put that equation back together, that the God-human relationship can be understood better if we understand the two components better than we have culturally, historically, religiously, philosophically, and otherwise. And once we reach there, then we realize that perhaps the most important part is this connectedness between the two, then each of the two individually in and of themselves. So the relationship between God and human cannot be understood with the denial of either, but rather with an understanding of both, and better yet, with a better understanding of both the sacred and the profane, and the human and the divine. Have a nice day.